Welcome to The Healthy Advisor, a podcast from WealthManagement.com focused on advisors' personal well-being and healing. I'm Diana Britton, managing editor of WealthManagement.com, and in this podcast we explore some of the struggles and personal development issues facing advisors and financial services professionals, and how to get to a place of healing for mind, body, and spirit. Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the Healthy Advisor podcast, and thanks for joining us. As you may know, this is the podcast focused on financial advisor health and well-being, and today's guest has been studying this very topic for the last several years. His name is Michael Kitces. He's a blogger, chief financial planning nerd at Kitces.com, head of strategy at Buckingham Wealth Partners, and also the co-founder of the XY Planning Network, Advice Pay, New Planner Recruiting, FP Pathfinder, and FA Bean Counters. He has quite the resume. He's also a host of the Financial Advisor Success podcast. Just a well-known, great podcast out there. Michael, thank you so much. Welcome, and thank you for being on the podcast.
My pleasure, Diana. Appreciate the opportunity to join you and get to talk a little about advisor health and well-being.
Yeah, and so I'm so excited about this podcast episode. Number one, because it's you, Michael. You're, sought after speaker, pioneer in the industry, leader in this industry, and I'm really grateful to be tapping into your brain trust today. And second, we're going to be discussing Kitces Research's 2023 Advisor Wellbeing Study. And this topic is very near and dear to my heart. I've been speaking to advisors and industry execs about well-being and personal development since I launched this podcast in 2019, just before COVID. And I've really been coming at this topic from a more anecdotal perspective.
Yeah.
And you're sort of putting real measurable data behind it. And so that's really exciting for me. A little background about the study and the methodology. Kitces surveyed over 1,500 members of financial advisory teams on their current level of life quality or well-being based on a 0 to 10 scale. And the well-being rating averaged 6.84 across all respondents, which was roughly in line with the US population at large. But Michael, I want to start out by, just tell me a little bit about the history of this study. I know this is not the first one, but how did you kind of come up with the idea of measuring advisor well-being, and why is it important to have a discussion about that in the industry?
So this study kind of came about for me from two different angles that kind of converged at the same time several years ago. The first part of it was I had noticed this phenomenon and trend emerging where I was talking to a lot of what I would call mid-sized advisory firms, which is, in our industry context, think probably a couple $100 million under management, $200, $300, $500 million under management. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the advisors were really not terribly happy with their businesses. Like, they were making pretty good money. The math gets pretty good at that point, but they had business challenges and people challenges and growth challenges and scaling challenges and operations challenges and HR challenges, like all this stuff. And they're like, I've made the business bigger, but now I actually kind of feel like I'm more a slave to my business than I was before. So I was seeing this phenomenon of sort of like anecdotally, as you noted earlier, but like a lot of firms that were growing bigger and the advisors seemed less happy. And then at the same time, I noticed this sort of parallel that when I really looked out, I said, of the advisors I know, who are the happiest advisors that I know? Like, they just seem to be happy with their businesses and life and everything that's going on. And I found overwhelmingly, they were solo practitioners. When I thought of happy advisors I knew, it was pretty much all solo practitioners who they had a clear client base they worked with. They did really good work for those clients. They got compensated well for their services. They worked like 30 hours a week because they didn't have a ton of clients. They just had a small subset of really good clients. and they were really happy in their
Mm,
practices and their lives, and they weren't huge by industry standards of like big, 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 grow, 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 but they were pretty good income. I can do the math on a solo practice with tens of millions of dollars, and they seemed really happy. And so
mhm,
watching this phenomenon of, when I, at least anecdotally, like when I looked for the happiest advisors, they tended to be really small. And then when I looked at where I was seeing some of the unhappiest advisors, they tended to be in bigger firms. I was like, well, I wonder if there's something going on here, because the industry certainly has a mantra of grow, 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 right? If you're not growing, you're dying. We tell all these stories about growth. And then I'm looking at the advisor community. I'm like, but I don't actually see more happiness in the advisors who are growing. I wonder if there's something going on.
mm.
And that's what spawned us to say, well, maybe we should do a research study on this. We started doing research on our platform kind of through kitces.com back in late 2017 into 2018. We did some studies on how financial advisors do their planning process. We've done some studies on how advisors market. And I kind of came this feeling of like, I'd like to really look at what's going on with their well-being. We have all these practice management benchmarks for the financial health of an advisory firm. How about like the health, the well-being health of the advisor themselves? And that's what emerged into this well-being study that we first launched in early 2020, not knowing what else was going to be going on in 2020 at that point. We did it again in the second part of 2021, and now we've just put it onto a regular biannual schedule. So we did it in 2023, and we'll queue up another one in 2025 and every other year going forward from here.
I love it. I just love it. And I mean, I know that like maybe 20 years ago or something, we were writing about, at Registered Rep magazine, there were studies coming out that showed that financial advisors were actually more prone to like addiction, obesity, burnout, stress. And so I'm really curious to see how that has changed, where we're at now. And obviously like the industry's just come so far in terms of more independence, more less of a focus on pushing products and selling on commissions and things like that. But first, I mean, are any definitions that we should go over first? Like, I was curious how you're actually defining
Yeah.
well-being and happiness, for instance.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we decided we did not want to reinvent the wheel on this. So one of the best known studies on well-being is actually run by Gallup, the
Mm,
like global polling organization. They do an international well-being study. It's incredibly well reputed and very rigorously done. Of, I forget what it is, like a 130 different countries around the world. They survey millions of people, and it's all built around a particular measure of well-being that was first created by a social researcher many years ago named Cantrell, and it's built around a very specific question. And the question is, so imagine a ladder with steps that are numbered. The bottom of the ladder is a 0, and the very top of the ladder is a 10.
mm,
So the top of the ladder represents the best possible life for you, and the bottom of the ladder represents the worst possible life for you.
mm,
On what step of the ladder would you say you personally feel you stand at this time?
mhm.
So it's asking people to rate themselves on their own version of whatever their best and worst possible life is. So
Okay.
it's interesting to me as a measure, right? It's in many ways like it's not an objective measure of where someone's, financial health and well-being and success is. It's on their perception of where they are relative to where they think they could be as their best possible life, or where they're not as their worst possible life. So you get this series of scores. As you noted earlier, the general population in the US averages about a 6.9 on this scale.
Mm,
When we measured advisors, it was almost exactly the same thing, 6.84, which was not statistically significantly different. So financial advisors, at least on average, show up the same way to this question as the average American in general. So there's not a, yes, advisors financially earn incomes that are well above the average American, but sort of directly the point on well-being, more money does not necessarily make us happier. Advisors are not particularly happier than the average American when we measure them on this well-being scale. The particular focus that we had for the study, though, and what I wanted to start looking at as I'd begun this thread of research was say, okay, well, like on average, advisors may average out to the general American overall, but if we start then drilling down to who the advisor is, what they do, where they work, how they're paid, right? If we start getting like some of the the ways that we draw different lines within the industry,
Yeah.
what I was really curious to see as we had sort of started out in this study is trying to answer the question of, are there particular segments that seem to be doing better or worse? Like, do we find happy advisors in one channel and less happy advisors in another channel? Or are there certain demographics that lead to happiness or psychographics that lead to happiness? That's much of what we were looking for initially, and we tried to frame it up into this thing that I call the factors that matter, like the particular drivers that seem to most be associated with advisors who have greater well-being than the average.
Yeah, that's great. What are some of those top drivers, those factors that are driving happiness?
So ultimately, we found the biggest drivers around advisor well-being was what I'm now starting to call like the big four. There were, we measured, I mean, ultimately it was 100+ different variables that we were testing through this process, but we found they kind of grouped into four main domains. The first was autonomy.
Mm.
Do you have autonomy? And autonomy in the context of advisors seems to show up in two particular ways. Do you have autonomy in how your clients are served?
Mhm.
If I can't serve my clients the way that I believe they should be served, I get really frustrated as an advisor, right? Sort of makes intuitive sense, but we live in a highly regulated, compliance-driven industry. So when those lines start to clash between I can't serve clients the way I want to serve them and believe they should be served because I'm having limitations in my firm, the unhappiness starts to rise.
Mm.
And the second domain that we found around autonomy is autonomy of time. So, do I have control over my time and how I'm spending my time? If I'm not in control of my own schedule, if I'm kind of a slave to the business or the boss or the clock or their agenda or anything to that effect, advisor well-being starts to go down when when those various autonomy factors start to go down. So
Mm.
we found autonomy was kind of the first biggest driver, which to me at a meta level sort of made sense. Like, oh, well, that probably helps to explain why there's like a 20+ year industry trend in the general direction of independent channels
Yes.
because they allow for more autonomy to let us serve the clients we want to serve the way we want to serve them and control our own time and schedules the way that we want to live our lives.
Mm. Did that sort of correlate with advisors that were like, sort of independent contractors versus those that were employees of a firm or,
It
more the W-2 model?
It did, but not dominatingly, as though all W-2 advisors are unhappy and all
And they
independent
don't have
advisors
autonomy. Yeah,
are
right.
are are unhappy. A, because this autonomy is one of multiple factors, but B, even within employee models, some employee model firms still allow their advisors a lot more flexibility than others, either around their control and flexibility of their schedule or their control and flexibility about how they serve their clients. So even within the W-2 realm, not all W-2 roles are the same, but the general arc is towards control over my time and control to be able to serve my clients the way that I believe they should be served. And
Mm.
indirectly, what what we seem to find is that, frankly, as advisors, we're pretty good at self-sorting into these industry channels, at least over time. We all start wherever we're going to start and then find out whether that was a good fit for us or not. But by the time we get to advisors who are 7 to 10 years in, we see a lot of rises in happiness. We'll actually talk about that in the moment as kind of second driver. But there does seem to be this process that if we're one of those types that really favors the autonomy independence side, we migrate towards those channels. If we don't actually care about that, or we're at a firm like, look, they give me the autonomy and the things I care about, and then they handle all the rest of the stuff that I don't really want to deal with anyways, a
Mm.
lot of advisors are quite happy to stay in employee channels, W-2 channels, large firm channels, if they still get autonomy in the few parts that are important to them, and then they just don't have to deal with the rest that they don't necessarily want to have to deal with. Because
Yeah.
indirectly, one of the things that we see where unhappiness starts to crop up in the independent channel is if you're really building your own firm as an independent, you have to figure all these things out yourself as an independent,
Mm.
which is not everyone's happy place. What we actually found from the very first study when we had put it out was kind of reaffirming the anecdotal data that I was finding in the first place. We had found from the very first well-being study that the unhappiest advisors had an average of $225 million under management.
Mm.
The unhappiest advisors had an average of $225 million under management. And it's not just a random number plucked out of thin air. Most advisory firms, we talk about 1% fees, but we've got breakpoints, clients we household, big clients we give some deals to, some accommodation clients we have. If you really take an advisory firm's revenue, like the actual dollars they bill, and divide it into their assets under management, what you find in practice is most AUM firms actually have a revenue yield of about 70 to 80 basis points. So if
Mm.
I'm $225 million under management, I'm probably somewhere around $1.7 to $1.8 million of revenue.
Okay.
Now, most advisory firms at that size have about $250,000 of revenue per employee.
Okay.
So a $1.7 million firm typically has 7 people.
Mm.
Now, if you look up any classic book on management,
Mm.
management books will typically tell you that most managers will start to struggle if they get more than about 6 to 8 direct reports. More
Okay.
than that, like it's just hard to manage all the people and develop them and stay involved in their things and unblock them. And so if you look at a $225 million advisory firm, they probably have 7 team members, which means the owner is right at the absolute max of what a manager typically can handle. And they probably are servicing 100 to 150 clients of their own, which is
Mm.
also at or above the maximum that most advisors can comfortably handle. And that firm owner is doing both jobs at the same time, which means the hours tend to be very high. The autonomy is very low. You might be independent, but that just means you've ended up being a slave to your business and all the needs and demands that it has because of all the clients and all the team at the same time. And so that's why we found, like, notwithstanding this discussion around the desire for autonomy, the unhappiest advisors were independent advisors with $225 million under management.
Mm.
Again, not say everybody at that size is categorically unhappy, but that's where we found the heaviest concentration of advisors who were struggling with very low well-being scores because this business had built up to the point where it may be an independent business, but the business is controlling them, and they're actually at a low point on autonomy.
That is really curious. What are the other factors that are driving happiness? And
So, so the second big factor that we found is experience. Raw years of client-facing experience is incredibly predictive of advisor well-being.
mm,
Now, on the one hand, like, not terribly helpful to say that for anybody who's newer in the industry and doesn't have experience, because like you can't do anything about that short of time and stick it out and try to get through to the point that you are more experienced. Although it
Mhm.
does has implications of if you're still earlier in your career and feeling a little down because it is rough early in the industry, what we can say very broadly and confidently from our data is advisors in their early years are fairly universally unhappy, and it really does get better over time with
Mm.
basically no end. We found advisors in their 50s were generally happier than advisors in their 40s. Advisors in their 60s were happier than advisors in their 50s. And advisors in their early 70s, because we had a non trivial number who were still in the
Mm.
business, were happiest of all. So, on the one hand, like, just experience is powerful in our industry. You build brand and reputation in your community that makes business development easier. You hone your communication skills, which makes client relationships easier. You learn your technical craft, which makes just all the technical advice giving stuff easier. And you typically just build a client base and some recurring revenue. So you're not going through the lean hungry years that almost everybody still goes through in the early days. And so that combination makes experience incredibly powerful for advisors. It means, as I tell younger folks sometimes, like, you got to bear in mind this profession is much more of a marathon than a sprint. So pace yourself so that you can stay in the game in the long run, so you can stay in the race in the long run, because it's really good in the long run, but you have to make choices that allow you to stay in long enough to get there. On the flip
Yeah.
side, I think our research indirectly helps to illustrate at large why there's such a broad lack of adoption of succession planning in our industry, because the happiest advisors are in their 60s and 70s. They are also the highest earning advisors. If you look at any of the benchmarking data, because you've been in for a long time, you got your basic clients, it's pretty profitable once you get to that point. And so advisors in their 60s are the highest earning, lowest hours worked, highest well-being advisors.
Mm.
Why would you leave?
Yeah. That
And
makes sense.
and in the end, like, most don't want to leave. I mean, I obviously health and or fate will dictate that outcome at some point, but no one's in a hurry to leave any faster than they need to. It's good work, it's meaningful work, it's psychologically rewarding, it's financially rewarding. It's not that hard at that stage, and you feel really good about it. Why would you retire from that?
Yeah, I mean, we run into those older advisors, in their 60s and 70s at conferences, and they're a pretty happy-go-lucky bunch.
Yeah.
They're out there with their Hawaiian shirts and
Uh-huh.
um you wouldn't think that there was any unhappiness in the industry from meeting those guys.
Yeah.
I
So that's the second big factor that we found. And it's an interesting dynamic. Like, autonomy, the whole point of autonomy is control, but we have some control over our autonomy because we can make choices about what firms we work with, what platforms we're on, what channels we're in, and dial that to either quite where we are on the autonomy spectrum, because some are pretty hardcore and some just kind of want to control the few things that they really care about controlling, and just figure out where you care about autonomy, right? Some of us care about everything in the business down to, like, the type of metal on the door handles, and others really just want to control a couple of key things about what they do and how they serve their clients, and they're happy to have a big firm take care of the rest, which is why we still see advisors across all channels. So
mm,
autonomy is one that we have a lot of control over, because we can decide where we work and who we affiliate with, and just make sure we pick the thing that aligns to our preferences. Experience is largely just a function of time,
yeah.
aside from making the choice to stay in long enough to get there.
Hmm.
The the third big factor that we found is around team. Uh and I want to asterisk this as we and a caveat as we get out of the gate. Overall, what we found is that advisors that are on teams tend to be happier than those who are not. Uh
Hmm.
Now, that doesn't mean everybody should be on a team or should be forced towards a team. There are a subset of us who just really like being independent and on our own. We do not want to have to manage people. And if you take someone who does not want to team up and manage people and make them team up and manage people, you are not making them happier by giving them a team. You're just pissing them off because you're taking away their autonomy, which was the number one factor we talked about earlier. So this is not about forcing advisors towards teams, but as a bunch, we are kind of team and other and service oriented. It's why you pick the profession of financial advice and helping other people by giving them advice for a living. And so as advisors, we do gravitate towards teams, but even more so what we find is that a lot of the focus on teams comes down to allowing advisors to only do the stuff that they most enjoy doing and being able to delegate the rest. So advisors who have the biggest lift we find is simply advisors who have administrative support, client service administrators, so that they can delegate paperwork and tasky work, show a pretty good lift in well-being. Advisors who are part of broader teams, so they're not the only advisor in the firm, someone else to take the call when they're on vacation, tend to have greater well-being than others. Ironically, we found that advisors who have associate advisors on their teams, not actually happier, not less happy, but not happier, because associate advisor tends not to be quite as much of a delegation and sharing the work. It tends to be more of a, I'm developing this advisor to come up and maybe be a lead advisor someday, who I could hand off some clients to. But at the associate stage, I can't hand anything off to them yet. I just kind of got to bring them along and spend some extra time training them that I didn't necessarily have time to do right now. So we were sort of struck by the finding around that advisors that have team members they can really effectively delegate to tend to be happier. Advisors who are just on teams to expand capacity and do more doesn't necessarily give us a lift in well-being. It's not worse, but we don't get the lift. We get the lift when we're actually able to let go of some things to team members that are better suited to the roles and tasks.
That makes sense. And was there a fourth factor that you said?
There was. The fourth factor for us was sort of a combination of advisors who are here because they want to serve. We actually found pretty directly, if we segment advisors into those that picks the profession for service over those who pick the profession for income, the service mindset advisors have significantly higher well-being than the income-oriented advisors. Notably, the income-oriented advisors do make more. They have been successful in finding their paths to higher incomes, significantly higher incomes. But the service-oriented advisors still made good money, and the service-oriented advisors were happier. But you were only happy as a service-oriented advisor if you actually got paid pretty well for your work. So what we found is that there's a large segment of advisors who are so service-oriented, bless their souls, that we accommodate a lot of clients who maybe aren't the best fit. We don't like saying no to people. We have maybe more clients than we probably should, but we don't want to turn them away because we'd feel bad if we turn them away. But the end result is we work a lot of hours for not a lot of money relative to the time that we spend in our practice. And we ultimately find that well-being goes down. If we do too much service and we don't actually get paid well for the work that we do, ultimately it tends to be a drag on well-being. And so there's sort of a service mindset, but service with boundaries, and service where you still actually get paid for the value of the service that you're bringing is the combination that's most associated with advisors that have a good well-being.
That's great. I know we're almost coming up on time, but I wanted to get to a couple other points that I think are really important here.
Yeah.
And there's one, that really stood out at me, and I mean, a lot of folks in this industry are trying to build firms and platforms and serve advisors in the best way. And they don't often think about well-being and burnout and things like that. But there's a finding in here that you found that thriving advisors who are the happiest, they were 4 times less likely to leave their current employer or platform relative to struggling advisors. And so That to me implies that there's a business case to employers and platforms fostering happiness and engagement among their advisors. And so what do you think employers, firms, platforms can do to create better engagement and foster well-being?
Oh, it's a great question. So first of all, I just said, well, firm, yes. Like it was something I very specifically wanted to measure in the study. I wanted to see, like, at the end of the day, does well-being actually show up in turnover, or do we just kind of stick it out unhappy because we're tied to our clients and our client base? And as you noted, we really did find that turnover rate, departure from both current firm and the industry overall, is about 4x higher for advisors who are struggling on their well-being than thriving on their well-being. And again, that's not a money thing. A lot of the struggling advisors actually make great money. The money is good, but they're miserable in the firm because they're making a lot of money and working more hours than they want to and not getting to see their family and enjoy the things that they want to enjoy in life. So they make their
Yeah.
money and then they say, screw it, I'm out of here. And they walk away with their money and they leave the industry and the firm loses them.
Hmm.
So we really do see a very material business impact around firms helping their advisors around well-being. From a practical perspective, I would say there's three things I think that firms can look at and focus on in trying to support team members this way and kind of around the factors that we talked about. The first is giving your advisors as much autonomy as they can, as they can. Compliance is obviously still there, but giving advisors as much autonomy as they can, specifically around how they serve clients. The biggest friction point is when I can't serve my clients the way that I believe they should be served to be served well, is where the biggest autonomy friction crops up. And
Mm.
this is a phenomenon I find that is particularly challenged in larger firm platforms because of a phenomenon that I've now taken to calling LCD compliance. LCD is short for lowest common denominator. It's that subset of firms that implement compliance policies and procedures based on the lowest common denominator. Whatever the one biggest knucklehead in the entire firm could possibly do to screw over our clients, because unfortunately there are some bad apples out there,
Yeah.
every good advisor gets dragged down to the compliance processes and procedures of the worst advisor in the firm.
Hmm.
And if you're a really big firm and you have a really large number of advisors, there's a really big spread between the average good advisor and the worst advisor that you're writing policies and procedures for. Firms figuring out how to address that. And there are some techniques in the compliance world. You do more risk-based assessments. You have more risk-based approaches where your advisors who already have track records of serving clients well don't quite need the same level of low bar scrutiny as your newer advisors or your more problematic advisors. Adapting your compliance to allow good advisors to serve their clients well has a big impact in advisor autonomy turnover. And the ones that can't figure that out tend to see more turnover. The second factor I would say is providing advisors support to delegate the things that they don't want to be doing and shouldn't be doing anyways. So admin support, paraplanner support, services is now growing in many ways as a B2B offering with advisors, right? We see firms doing large firms in particular doing internal paraplanning desks, expanding their advanced markets desks, providing more admin and virtual assistant support. So for advisors that maybe struggle to hire and manage their own people, platforms and firms that can provide more of the support delegation, just let advisors serve clients and not have to deal with and worry about the rest, tend to do well, with, again, the caveat, autonomy still matters most. So you can't take the things away from the advisors and tell them to stop doing it. You have to make it available for them and then let them choose to do it, because otherwise your team efforts violate the autonomy principle and you still got a problem.
Hmm.
The third dimension that I would highlight is providing support so that advisors can actually take time off. Most advisors would struggle mightily to take a 1-week vacation where they disconnect. And it basically comes down to, if my client calls and has an actual financial planning problem, there's no one to take the call. And if they've got a financial need and like need to do a trade and raise cash, there's no one to take the call and do the trade.
Mm.
And so if you can solve for, particularly again, as a larger firm, if you can solve for who would take the emergency call from the client and who would do the trade if they needed the trade, providing just that level of support so the advisor can actually go take a vacation and disconnect for a week is really powerful. It ultimately gets to hours worked and autonomy over time and a lot of other powerful impacts that support retention in the long run and lift well-being in the long run.
Yeah, well, I think these are just some great practical steps firms can take, and as firms get larger and become more of an organization, an enterprise, these are things to take to heart. Well, I'm afraid we're just about out of time, and I'd like to, I want to honor your time, Michael. I'd like to thank my guest, Michael Kitces, for being on the podcast and sharing just some really great insights on advisor well-being. Michael, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Diana. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and if you'd like to reach out to Michael or you have questions about the study or anything else, you can reach him at questions@kitces.com. And if you struggle yourself, if you wish to share your experiences and help others in similar situations, please feel free to reach out to me at diana.britton@informa.com. I'd like to thank you for listening to The Healthy Advisor. If you've not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This is Diana Britton reminding you that where there's healing, there is hope. We'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to The Healthy Advisor, a podcast focused on advisors' personal well-being and healing. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of WealthManagement.com. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice. Always seek the advice of your healthcare provider with any questions you may have regarding your particular situation.